the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
This video discusses retools and redecos of figures already covered in episodes 85 and 107. For the sake of avoiding redundancy, certain review elements will be largely glossed over. They've already been covered in previous episodes, so there's not really much point. It is recommended to watch these two previous videos covering these molds to gain a full understanding about this box set. Anyway, on with the review. Here's an interesting thing that people really like to gloss over. Exclusives can be great. In a perfect world, every character has enough fans to justify a retail release. You walk into a store and, oh look at that, Super Megatron got a repack because he sold so well the last time. Unfortunately, general consumers don't particularly care about obscure characters. Sure, you can release the main Maximal lineup without much issue, but if you want to do a transmutate, well, you got two options. You can underpack her by putting only one per case, which still won't guarantee she won't shell form, or you can make her a limited quantity exclusive. Honestly, the kinds of exclusives Hasbro has been doing lately have been pretty great for the most part. Plenty of Diaclone throwbacks, a renaissance of shattered glass that throws a big middle finger to fun pub aftermarket prices, and even weird obscure hobby homages that sell themselves on how bonkers they look. Now, of course, not all exclusives are created equally. Selects are generally pretty easy to come by, and people outside the US can fairly easily import Walgreens figures from Asia. But Target exclusives, you might as well bite the scalper bullet the moment they're announced, because freight forwarding is essentially banned due to policies almost as racist as Road Ranger.
I'm going to say the N-word!
A lot of shade has been thrown at the Amazon lines too. Sure, they're normally fairly easy to obtain, with some extremely frustrating exceptions. But often people get really angry over who they pick and how the releases are handled. I think this fandom frustration deserves a closer look, so in order to take a microscope right up to this conundrum, greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to the Battle Across Time Collection WFC-K40 Autobot Mirage and Maximal Grimlock. Right off the bat, this set was controversial as f***. Kingdom is a line that manages to get its greedy mitts into two very distinct fandom niches. The Bob the Builder Club with their brick fetish, and the furry crowd. Releasing rare and obscure figures in either of these lineups would be cause for celebration, but chuck them into the same box and people are obviously going to get tetchy. 80s fans really aren't going to be interested in a twice-removed homage to a G1 character that looks nothing like said G1 character. And 90s fans aren't going to be interested in yet another Mirage, especially after the last one stank. Complaints for this set, and to a lesser extent the following one, were rife across the internet. And what was the result of this? Everybody bought them anyway. Complain all you want, but the outcome of this choice was crystal clear. These toys sold. Sure, it meant people had to sell shit off on the aftermarket, but it goes to show there's a market for both types of figures, making this a genius market move. Is it a little anti-consumer? Possibly. Would it have been better to have these released in the Selects lineup? 100%, but as far as Amazon exclusives go, these have been way more successful than their predecessors, although part of that's likely due to limited production numbers, something which they fortunately rectified this time round. So the context, as frustrating as it may seem, makes sense, but how does the content itself turn out? Well, taking a look at King Grimlock, the lizard gizzard, he's alright, I guess. I mean, obviously he's not going to be as resplendent a fellow as Dinobot, a fact pretty obvious even when they aren't standing next to each other. But it's not a bad Dino mode by any means. Typically with redecos, the budget allocation gets shifted around certain parts. It's not always the case, but often some parts of the redeco end up looking infinitely better, whilst others end up looking abysmally worse. Grimlock is a pretty good example of this. The head sculpt is an absolute knockout, retaining the ferocity of the original head sculpt whilst also adding even more sharpness through the gorgeous paintwork. This kind of inverse flame design and piercing green eye combo really gives an evil twin feel to this figure, which is ironic considering Dinobot is the closest to the Predacons out of the two. Also, fun fact, the neck is actually spring-loaded, a subtle use of automorph for the chest. I never noticed that on the original release, really puts into perspective how classy this mold is. Now, the kibble underneath is definitely a little more egregious since you can see a lot of the detail more clearly, but everything above looks surprisingly crisper in this grey. Sure, the brown on Dinobot looks far more cohesive, but the Dino skin pops way more on the newer version. I also adore the white stripes on the back of the tail, which reveals one improvement that was sorely missing from his predecessor, the lack of a democracy manifest on the tail tip. This looks so much better, blending right in with the stripes in the underside of the tail. Weird that these are two different sprues though, but oh well. Now comparing the two side by side, yes, Dinobot is obviously the better looking. His subtle animation inspired spikage feels a lot more premium and there's a lot less wonky color breakup, but still this is a pretty decent Grimlock. And sure, I'm fully aware that this is a massive departure from the original toy, missing those prolific lovable spots. Would this have made the toy look a lot better? Probably. Can't say for sure, but it certainly would have been more unique. However, even ignoring the fact that in general Kingdom tends to push their beasts through a realism filter, with varying degrees of success, the omission here doesn't ruin the aesthetic overall. It's not like Combiner Hunter Windblade taking away the color breakup and giving us a barrage of overbearing red. It's still a solid dino, bringing forth all the good and bad attributes of the mold. And hey, it's not like they aren't referenced at all. You've got a few black spots at the back here, and even some white sleeve breakup on the arms to tie everything together. You can tell the deco designers cared about bringing this character to life, even if they didn't have the biggest budget to play with. That's not to say he's entirely without issues, though. And I don't just mean shared issues with the original. Oh no. After the review of Crossover's Maverick, I thought I was finally free of the icky white plastic epidemic, but apparently not. The plastic used on the sides of the legs, the ones that end up forming the chest, are, to be frank, disgusting. I wouldn't say they're as bad as Maverick's, since this just looks like slightly molded wax, whereas the cursed plane looks like month-old ejaculate hardened into plastic form, but Jesus, it sticks out like a sore thumb. Or I suppose a sore thigh. Wait, why do I keep using that phrase? Don't know if I want that to become a running gag. Seems derivative. There's a smidge more on the body, however fortunately most of it gets confined to the underside of the dino mode, letting the grey on the top do most of the visual work. Thank for that too, crisis averted. But seriously, once you notice it, it's really hard to ignore. With Dinobot, these clean panels acted as a distraction from the kibbly nonsense on the bottom, but with Grimlock, the kibble is almost acting as the distraction from this ugly shit. I wouldn't say it's enough to damn the dino mode entirely, but please Hasbro, stop using this shit. What is with Hasbro and terrible uses of white plastic and paint lately? It's not that hard. You keep doing decent examples of this, then 2 weeks later we're back to this shit. Oh well, it's very hard to get angry with this figure anyway, thanks to the incredibly solid core. Dinobot had a great beast mode, so logically Grimlock should at least be passable. Mirage, on the other hand, well, it's a different story. To be fair, I opted for the Decepticon version of the original, with its admittedly slick color scheme and fortunate lack of clear plastic knees. That said, not even a killer paint job could save this mess of a figure. In vehicle mode, the problem was simple, this abysmal spoiler section on the top here. The arm conversion decision was baffling, like forget the faux chest at the back here, this is where the real confusion kicks in. Of course, retooling is a complicated process. There's really only so much you can do, and although Hasbro has actually had a pretty decent track record of turning space wheelers into Earth drivers, when they f*** up, they really f*** up. And even then, the successful attempts were all from already solid base molds. In theory, all this should amount to is polishing a turd. In practice though, holy shit, it actually worked! No, I'm dead serious. They've turned this base mold from something garbage into something genuinely good. Not just good in comparison to the original, good on its own merits. Right out of the box, you can tell this is where the priorities lay. Given this line is supposed to spotlight the beasts, I would have much preferred a budgetary shift to put more effort into Grimlock, but given what we ended up with, they did a bang-up job here. This is of course possible thanks to the sheer amount of retooling on show. Like, holy barely anything here is the same. The leg chassis have been completely reworked. Sure, they probably could have reused some of the parts here, but apparently nope. They redid the whole thing so they could add in an open seat section. Commendable, even if there's no compatibility with any sort of master. The majority of the arm assembly has been redone too, which doesn't just mean a sleeker spoiler section, but also a much slimmer back third. The spoiler now actually looks like a spoiler as opposed to a mechanical tumor that just sits atop an otherwise sleek-looking cyberpunk car. This of course means no more faux chest at the back, thanks to it migrating to the underside. It was never a problem that particularly bothered me, but it sure as hell did most people. The only visible parts that have remained the same are the wheels, the bonnet, and the feet, which sadly don't line up quite as well on this new design, but are still far from terrible. Even the axle assembly has been redone from the ground up, which I really commend. Not for anything seen in this mode, but rather for stuff we'll tackle later. Now looking underneath again, the shared engineering becomes clearer, with similar wastes to thigh assemblies, but as far as what you're actually going to see, I'm honestly astonished. Not even the sizes are identical, with completely different length, width, and height dimensions. Of course, this is all discussing it as a retool of an obviously trash earlier release, but the question remains, is it good by its own merits? The answer is quite simple. Yes, absolutely yes. Out of context as its own thing, you can put this on a desk and instantly tell what it's supposed to be. There's no confusion, no face palming. It's a solid generic Formula 1 car that does what it's supposed to do. Is it perfect? Well, no. You've got new issues such as a smidge of hollowness around the arm sections, and sometimes pieces don't like to stay tabbed together that well, but on the whole, it's a decent release. If you're sick and tired of the stupid antics of the Siege version, simply on the facts that the spoiler doesn't look like Rung during the planking challenge almost a decade too late, and the sides aren't constructed from the plastic equivalent of sticking ice in a bucket full of broken and glass in a McDonald's deep fryer, this is a wonderful G1 styles Mirage. At least as far as the vehicle mode is concerned, it's a perfect update, Earth versus Cybertronian aesthetics aside. However, if this is your first Mirage and you absolutely need something in the G1 aesthetic, it also works pretty damn well. I still don't think it's the best overall G1 Mirage on the market. That award remains with the Classics version due to solidity in both overall design and in the physical sense. But if you're dead set on that 1980s lineup in the 1980s aesthetic, yeah, I think you'll be satisfied. But that's the vehicle modes. How do the robot modes fare? Well, I guess that's as good a transition as any. God, I can never figure out how to get these segues right. I've gotta up my writing game. One of the most convenient things about reviewing redecos of figures I've already covered is I don't need to repeat myself. It's super easy, barely an inconvenience. You want to see the transformation for Grimlock? It's identical to Dinobot, so we don't need to cover either of these. I will mention that in the original video I did kind of up the arms, the Dino arms there. They're supposed to neatly fold into the torso like so, and I am sorry about that. But aside from that, get the out of here. We don't need to talk about that. I did the same thing in the Select Sandstorm video, and for some reason people got really mad about that, but I'd just be redundant at that point. I've just already done that thing on camera before. That said, there are plenty of differences between the Siege and Kingdom versions of Mirage. Yes, it is technically a retool, but there is so much different here. The shell is basically the same, but the tolerances are all changed. And the chest section, well, that's completely different. Question is, which is better? Well, let's take a look. First thing you want to do is come to the arms and lift them up from the bonnet over there. Or should I say the body, not the bonnet. You separate the arms like that. They sort of hinge up as well as hinge out on this hinge and also the shoulder hinge, I suppose. But don't do much with it yet. We just need some space here. Space to get the legs out. You want to do almost the same thing you did with the Siege version, which is get these out kind of separated and out they come, out the whole thing comes. And just like the Siege version, these things rotate in, but listen to that. Nice clickety locking points. It's not ratcheted, it's just octagonal joints where they kind of lock into place, but it does the job fine. Of course, not much in detail is needed for these bits because they transform identically to the Siege version, but much more sturdily. Like, this is not going anywhere. Massive improvement. Anyway, the thighs rotate into place. Come to these hinges and bring them up all the way and out of the way. Come to the back and bring this section down. That'll allow you to push that panel in, which will bring the head up, and this thing clips close again. Then you can rotate the wheels in like so, and that will reveal two tabs on the side here. That will allow you to rotate these mushroom pegs around and bring in these clips into place. The connection port is pretty loose, unfortunately. It mainly relies on the friction of the shoulders, which is a bit annoying as you get later on, but it does it for the most part. Rotate the fists outward like that, and rotate the spoilers into place like so. And to complete the look, you've got a double hinge at the back here that collapses down into the torso, collapsing this whole thing into place. It does click into place nice and solidly, so everything stays together nicely. And that's the end goal of this guy. Everything is nice and solid, compared to the loosey-goosey of the Siege version. But let's be honest here. That's the end result we're talking about. The end result is much more solid on the Kingdom version, hands down. But if we're talking about transformations, well, barely have to give it to the Netflix Siege version. Now, if we're talking about the regular Siege version with the clear plastic shins, absolutely not. Transforming that one is basically a plastic death trap. It's eventually going to shatter into a million pieces, so no way the transformation is winning in that category. But for this version, at least, it does feel far more satisfying. Again, the end result is definitely not worth the more satisfying transformation, but here, it does feel a little more clunky with those much tighter tolerances on the legs. So that is kind of a way that that one would win, but ultimately it's a misguided win. It's a win for the wrong circumstances they should be focusing on. So even though this has a more satisfying transformation, this wins overall hands down, and it basically loses the battle but wins the war, so it technically, categorically might be considered a better transformation to you. I don't know, a lot of things to consider with this one, but really this guy's surprising me at every turn. With both of these in their robot modes, yeah, once again you can tell where the priorities were. As much as I'd want the beasts to be the focus of the love and care and the line centered around Beast Wars, they of course put all the effort into the G1 figure. Doesn't matter that they are selling in basically equal numbers on the aftermarket, showing there's a demand for both of them. Grimlock definitely got shafted budget-wise. But well, we have what we have, and what we have is alright at least. Once again, Dino Dinobot ends up looking much more premium in comparison, but there are still things to like here. The color breakup is pretty nice, pulling the white t-shirt and bronze overalls look. I actually really like how the arms are now a bit segmented. Makes Grimlock feel far more savage than his thespian predecessor. That's also assisted with the absolutely stunning head sculpts. Seriously, one of the best head sculpts in the line. Although I guess given the quality of head sculpts overall, that's not really saying much these days. What can I say? Modern official Transformers just have great head sculpts. Don't know how they do it, but they continue to do it. And the bronze color. Holy shit, this is gorgeous. It seriously looks like they've painted the damn stuff, but nope, nothing but solid plastic here. Of course, that begs one question. Will this stuff hold up after long periods of time? Only said time will tell, but for now, man, it looks hella premium. Unfortunately, a lot of my praises really stop there. Aside from all the cool carryover positives from the original molds, like the killer proportions, extensive articulation, and genius way in which the chest works, it just ends up being bogged down with a lot of jank. Sure, the head sculpt is great, but thanks to the intense level of black paint required to get it to work, there's none left for the chest. This means the eyes are left completely blank, drawing in more attention to that horrible Maverick-like plastic. I'm honestly super glad it doesn't appear in larger quantities throughout the body. Sure, it shows up again on the biceps, but thankfully it doesn't seem to look as bad there. Don't know why, but thank God. But alas, it looks really bad when it's right here in plain center view. It also refuses to gel with the head in the middle. I get that this is a weird transformation to begin with, but some black paint on these panels to help tie the thing together would have really helped smooth things out. And I know that it would be considered a heavy deviation from the original, but Kingdom figures already deviate from their 1990s counterparts in regards to both animation and plastic versions. A small deviation here would be super beneficial for the sake of the overall aesthetic. Apparently people seem to think I'm obsessed with accuracy, but to be honest, it's quite the opposite. I don't give a rat's ass if something is accurate or not, only that it doesn't look like a cheap piece of garbage. I only go over accuracy because people constantly bring it up these days, and they want to know whether something is accurate or not. This toy is not accurate, but it's not frustrating because of that. It's frustrating because it's missing key paint apps that tie it together. Maybe it's because all the leftover bits from the Mirage mold had to be thrown out at the factory, kinda like a gunpla packing in extra bits on build fighter kits that never get used, but whatever the case, the end result stays the same. Plus, beyond that, you get weird tolerances. The torso and above is all fine, with joints as smooth as ever, but then you get to the waist and things get pretty dicey. Now, I got lucky with Dinobot. On my copy, the waist didn't turn out that bad. There was a little wobble, but nothing too ridiculous given the kind of joint being used. Unfortunately, that luck ran out with Grimlock here, because we got Wobble City. Apparently, this is actually an issue that affects the vast majority of copies, as opposed to an isolated QC incident that went away after another batch. On its own, though, I could probably overlook it, but then you get to the comically loose hips and the absurdly tight thigh swivels, and you realize between these three, he just won't be doing the can-can anytime soon. Grimlock isn't exactly a mess, but he introduces a whole slew of issues that Dinobot straight up didn't have to deal with. Some can be ignored, such as the incredibly lackluster paint on the weapons. It's a weapon, honestly, who cares? Others, however, cannot be so easily overlooked. This is not a bad figure by any means. 90% of Dinobot's positives carry over, something I have to reiterate thanks to the setup of this review, but there's stuff here that keeps this from reaching the same level of awesomeness as his predecessor. If you're a huge fan of the original and are able to get over the accuracy discrepancies, or are just looking to expand your Kingdom Beast lineup like I was, he'll be a satisfactory package, but not amazing. He's another solid release in a hella solid trilogy. In another line, he might have been the greatest it had to offer, but amongst masterpieces of engineering you can find at general retail, he does seem a bit lackluster. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Mirage has had quite the glow up. Of course, in the years since, this design has pivoted from G1 but stylized to straight up the arse G1. Personally, I never really had a problem with the general aesthetic of the Siege version, but I know a lot of people did, and I understand why they pivoted to this design choice. It's not something that I particularly care about, but if you do, you're in luck. The proportions are slimmer and he's much taller. Even with the exposed shoulder hinges, he feels much closer to his lanky Sunbow counterparts. None of that really registered with me when I first got him, though. Only one thought crossed my mind when I picked this guy up. Did they fix those god-awful legs? You know what? I reckon they dead-ass have, no joke. It might not seem like it at first glance, but examining what my issues were originally revealed it to be a very different story. I took issue with two things: how far the kibble jotted out, and more importantly, how loose it was. Firstly, these things were ridiculously cumbersome, meaning that any dynamic angle this figure was put into instantly became a kibbly mess. And secondly, these things were supposed to peg in, but pretty much didn't. Occasionally they'd lock in for a brief second, but after that they'd go back to their floppy ways. The retooled wheel cages fix both these issues by not only tweaking their hexagonal hinge tolerances, meaning they don't have to 100% rely on the tabs to keep them in place, but also also shrinking them massively, allowing them to sit further inside the leg shell, which also creates fewer chances for them to get knocked out of place to begin with. This also makes them a lot less of an eyesore. You can pose this guy and he doesn't look like a car crash from the waist down. And with that, my only major gripes with the original figure have been completely fixed. That already puts him above the original, since any flaws this figure introduces are hardly headache-inducing in comparison to the baffling decisions made prior. Of course, it makes more sense to focus on the remaining positives and neutrals first, so moving up a bit, the shins are pretty neat. I dig that they've actually used an aesthetically pleasing font for these. Sure, it's quintessentially Mirage, so it makes sense to use this outline system, but Aztec have been known to drop the ball on this as of late. Repro label shouldn't be mandatory for a figure, especially with an exclusive like this. Now for me, my original copy was the Netflix version, so I don't think about this next tidbit too much, but for most people, they got stuck with the retail release. You know what that one had? Clear plastic shins. Yeah, what the f***, mates? Do y'all have any idea how stupid this is? It's like resting a bowling ball on a table made out of glass. It might be okay for a moment, but eventually the whole thing is going to break into a gazillion pieces. I'm not typically one to get super mad about clear plastic hinges on windshields and such, but this was just ridiculous. I'm glad they realized the stupidity and went back with a flat color this time. Moving up, the waist and shin innards are basically taken wholesale from the original, but oddly enough, the thighs are completely redone. Not sure why this was necessary, but right. Of course, that's not the biggest change with this robot mode. That would have to be the chest. You want G1 proportions? This here is G1 proportions. I do kind of wish they had cast some of these in white plastic, since there is a whole lot of white paint here, probably responsible for the lacking color scheme on Grimlock's robot mode. But either way, it looks hella cool. Also gets topped off with some wonderful red line work and with a properly centered Autobot symbol. You have no idea how refreshing that is. Of course, with this added new chest, a few issues get introduced. Nothing crazy, but definitely things to note before buying a figure like this. Not a lot of the original figure remains in this mode. From the waist up, it's really just the heads, the biceps, and the fists. Everything is completely new, but it still has to comply with the existing transformation scheme thanks to the internals on the lower half of the body. In order to do this, new shoulder joints have been added, and they're occasionally problematic. Often when trying to pull the arm out, you'll accidentally take the shoulder joint with it. A much more solid joint would have been greatly appreciated, especially considering both parts are entirely new pieces. These new hinges also remove some of the original functionality, and for many, this is a deal breaker. Mirage is well known for having a shoulder missile, and despite this figure retaining the same 3 weapons the original came with, there's nowhere to plug these into. And sure, the missile pieces still have that too long or too short annoyance, but most people don't care about that. They want a hole in the shoulder, not a chip on theirs when they find out that functionality was removed. Now, of course, upgrade kits are most certainly coming. It's a universal constant at this point. But some believe you shouldn't have to upgrade this sort of thing. Personally, given everything this figure does right, I really don't give a shit whether he's got a 5mm port on his collarbone or not. It's a non-issue for me, but for some people, it might be a total deal breaker that makes the original the definitive better version. If that's your view, well, hope you enjoy, mate. Just keep those shins out of the sunlight. Personally, what bothers me more is how loose these goddamn spoiler pieces are. Seriously, since the whole shoulder assembly is newly built from the ground up, would it have been so hard to get these to lock in properly? Just a simple locking point. Not gonna bother? Oh well, at least it's not as bad as Thrilling 30 Springer. That was a big bowl of yikes. Honestly, as much as I have to bring up these faults, they're incredibly minor. On his own, he's a ruddy good Mirage that should fit right into the G1 aesthetic lineup, if that's what you're going for. And compared to the original, well, there's no contest. If this was a versus review, the only category in which the Siege version could potentially win is the transformation, and even then it would be a dubious win thanks to the potential breakage on the shins, or the potential breakage on everything if you count the Amazon edition. Why? Just why? I'd even consider the articulation a slight step above. Grimlock is basically the same as Dinobot, so there's no reason to retread old ground. But Mirage actually comes with a bonus ab crunch if you mistransform it. It works extremely well, perhaps better than intentional ab crunches on figures thanks to the unintentional octagonal locking points on the joints. And it's above the waist swivel. You have no idea how much it pisses me off when they put these below the waist. Might as well just use the hip joints at that point. Of course, this edition comes at a price. He no longer has the butterfly joint from the Siege version. But since the accidental butterflies on old Craptastic here look unnatural anyway, whereas this ironically looks like it was intended in the design, in photography, and in person, yeah, I think we can easily call it here. I went into this set with completely off expectations. I expected Grimlock to be another standout use of the Dinobot mold and Mirage to ultimately be a failure thanks to a misguided turd polishing attempt. Turns out they didn't polish a turd at all. They took the criticisms to heart, threw out 99% of the original tooling and just used the CAD model as the base for something something new and interesting. It's a good Mirage, perhaps even a great Mirage for someone who's been waiting for the perfect G1 styled version. Conversely, Grimlock is a smidge disappointing. Had this kind of figure come out during Earthrise, he would have been one of the best toys the line had to offer, but amongst Kingdom, he's just okay. As a troop filler or a representation of that old Beast Wars toy, he'll do just fine. But if you've got no connection and are waiting for him to wow you, he ain't gonna do that. Might be best to skip it in that instance. Was this the outcome I was expecting and hoping for? Most certainly not, but that's what makes the review process so interesting. Examining context, challenging perceptions, discussing opinions that don't often line up with the norm. That's part of what makes it so fun. Individually, I'd probably give Mirage a solid 4 and Grimlock a solid 3. Neither of these are bad figures, but one is clearly getting more love than the other. However, when combining the scores for the box set as a whole, since Grimlock takes up 66% of the price point here, the score teeters closer to the 3 side of things. It's still a decent set and a massive leap above what Amazon was offering last year, but it's most definitely not for everyone, and considering my collecting sensibilities, maybe it wasn't for me after all. In the end, I think this sheds light on why exclusives can work so well. Grimlock, well, is self-explanatory. As a character that never ended up in the show to begin with, there was practically no chance for him getting a retail release. Yes, a select release would have been better due to wider distribution, but he was always going to be an exclusive. As for Mirage, at first it might not seem like he'd need exclusivity status to get made. A bunch of G1 characters are still selling pretty well in Kingdom, even if they're not doing as well as some of their bestial counterparts as the well for G1 nostalgia slowly dries up. However, given the immense amount of work for something like this only to be hit with a chance that kids might skip it after already owning the Siege version from a few years ago, it sounds too risky when put like that. Of course, this is merely a hypothesis and one potentially contradicted by the re-releases of Wheeljack and RC twice. Just why? However, those figures are some of the less budget-intensive releases from Earthrise, and coupled with their lack of development costs, they allow other figures to be built to a higher standard. Plus, Kingdom already has a lot of G1 in it. Not sure they had the room. So, is this release ideal? Absolutely not, but especially compared to the abysmal stock situation from last year, it's much better than those who came before. And hey, at least at the end of the day, people are still buying these after all the complaints, so they must be doing something right. So go ahead, if you're not into these, skip them. Not much is going to change your mind. If you're hella excited for these, knock yourself out. They shouldn't be too hard to find on the marketplace these days. They may not be what I expected, but I'm overall glad they exist. Even if I think Classics Mirage is the definitive Mirage. Oh, come on, it's got a superior robot mode, a clean transformation, and an infinitely expressive robot mode that makes up for the articulation limitations. What's not to love? G1 aesthetic? The f*** is that?